The first tear came without warning, splitting the worn leather like a wound opening on old skin. Maya Chen stood motionless in the center of Riverside Park as 3 teenagers circled her, their laughter sharp against the October wind. The larger boy, maybe 17 with acne scars mapping his jawline, held a piece of her jacket in his fist, the sleeve now hanging by threads from her shoulder. His friends, a girl with purple streaks in her hair and a skinny kid whose oversized hoodie swallowed his frame, kept their distance but urged him on with cruel whispers. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Look at this homeless freak, the boy sneered, his voice cracking on the word freak. Probably hasn't showered in weeks. Maya's fingers tightened around the paper bag containing her dinner, a gas station sandwich and an apple she'd bought with the last of her change. The bag crinkled, and the sound seemed to echo across the empty playground behind them. She could taste copper in her mouth, the metallic flavor of adrenaline mixed with something deeper, something that tasted like shame and exhaustion. The jacket had been her father's. Lieutenant Colonel James Chen, United States Army, had worn it through 3 deployments before hanging it in their hallway closet, next to Maya's mother's nursing scrubs. When Maya was 12, she would sneak into that closet during thunderstorms, wrapping herself in the leather that still smelled like gun oil and aftershave. Now 15 years later, it was all she had left of him, and these kids were destroying it with the casual cruelty that only comes from never having lost anything that mattered. "Yo, Marcus, check her pockets," the purple-haired girl called out. Her name was Jenna Ramirez, though Maya didn't know that yet. What Maya could see was the way Jenna's voice wavered slightly, as if she was trying to convince herself this was funny rather than feeling the sick twist in her stomach that came with watching someone suffer. Marcus, the boy with the acne scars, reached for Maya's jacket pocket, but she stepped back. The movement was subtle, controlled, her center of gravity shifting almost imperceptibly. Anyone who knew how to look would have recognized it as the stance of someone trained to fight. But these were just kids playing at being predators. "Don't touch me," Maya said quietly. Her voice carried across the park with a clarity that made the smallest boy, Tommy Nguyen, take a half-step backward. There was something in her tone that didn't match her appearance, something that suggested she was choosing not to fight rather than being unable to. The park stretched around them, like a stage set for this moment of cruelty. Riverside Park had been built in the 1970s, back when the city had money for things like community spaces and hope. The playground equipment was older now, the bright primary colors faded to pastels by decades of weather. The basketball courts, nets were frayed, and someone had spray-painted Lost Boys 4 EVR on the backboard in silver letters that glinted in the late afternoon sun. Maya had been coming here for 3 weeks, ever since she'd been evicted from her apartment. The park stayed open 24 hours, and the police rarely patrolled after dark. She'd found a bench near the memorial garden where she could sleep without being visible from the street, surrounded by rose bushes that her mother would have loved. Elena Chen had always said roses were the most honest flowers, beautiful but capable of drawing blood if you handled them carelessly. "I said don't touch me," Maya repeated, and this time Marcus hesitated. Something in her posture had changed, a subtle shift that made her seem larger despite her slight frame. But teenage cruelty has its own momentum, and Marcus had an audience. He lunged forward and grabbed the other sleeve of her jacket, yanking hard enough to spin Maya around. The leather, already weakened by years of wear and the harsh realities of living rough, gave way with a sound like fabric screaming. Marcus stumbled backward, clutching a piece of sleeve in his hand, while Maya's jacket hung in tatters around her shoulders. That's when they saw it. The tattoo ran along Maya's left forearm, visible now through the torn fabric. It wasn't large, maybe 3 inches of black ink that had been etched into her skin with military precision. But the design was unmistakable. The distinctive curved tab with Ranger spelled out in block letters, the same insignia that had been worn by America's elite soldiers for over 70 years. Marcus dropped the piece of leather like it had caught. "Fire! Holy shit!" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the oak trees that lined the park's perimeter. Jenna stepped closer, squinting at Maya's arm. "Is that real?" Maya looked down at the tattoo, and for a moment, her expression softened. The ink was surrounded by other markings. A compass rose on her wrist, coordinates tattooed in small numbers along her thumb, and the outline of a mountain range that wrapped around to her inner arm. Each mark told a story, but the Ranger tab was the one that mattered now. "Afghanistan," Maya said simply. 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 deployments. The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Marcus's face had gone pale beneath his acne scars, and he was backing away slowly, as if Maya might suddenly transform into something dangerous, which, in a way, she had. The homeless woman they'd been tormenting had become something else entirely. A soldier, a veteran, someone who had earned the right to wear one of the most respected insignias in the military. We didn't know. Marcus St. Maya bent down and picked up the piece of her father's jacket that Marcus had dropped. The leather was cracked along the tier, and one of the buttons had popped off and rolled somewhere into the grass. She held the fragment up to the light, studying the damage with the same careful attention she'd once given to equipment checks before missions. "My father wore this jacket," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made all 3 teenagers stand perfectly still. "Lieutenant Colonel James Chen. He died of cancer 2 years after his last deployment. Agent Orange exposure, they think, though the VA wouldn't admit it." She looked up at Marcus, and he flinched as if she'd struck him. "I've been wearing this jacket for 8 years. It's been through everything, with me sleeping in doorways, waiting in line at food banks, job interviews where they look at me like I'm broken goods. And you just tore it apart because you thought it would be fun to hurt someone you saw as weak." Tommy was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the destroyed jacket. Jenna had her arms wrapped around herself, looking like she might be sick. Marcus just stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Maya carefully folded the piece of leather and tucked it into her pocket. The rest of the jacket hung from her shoulders like the wings of a wounded bird, but she didn't take it off. Instead, she picked up her paper bag dinner and started walking toward the park's entrance. "Wait," Jenna called after her. "We're sorry. We're really, really sorry." Maya stopped but didn't turn around. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant smell of rain. Somewhere in the park, a dog was barking, and traffic hummed along the street beyond the fence. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a normal world where teenagers made mistakes and soldiers came home broken. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Maya said without looking back. "But maybe next time you'll think twice before deciding someone is weak just because they're down." She walked away, leaving the 3 teenagers standing in the gathering dusk, surrounded by pieces of leather and the weight of what they'd done. Behind her, she could hear Jenna sobbing and Marcus saying her name over and over, as if repetition could somehow undo the damage. Maya made it to the park entrance before she allowed herself to stop. She leaned against the brick pillar that held the park's dedication plaque, in memory of those who served, and finally looked down at what remained of her father's jacket. The tears came then, hot and bitter, for the jacket and for everything else she'd lost along the way. But as she cried, Maya didn't notice the figure watching from across the street. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been taking her evening jog when she'd seen the confrontation in the park. She'd stopped, phone in hand, ready to call police if necessary. Instead, she'd witnessed something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. 3 kids learning what it meant to truly harm someone, and one woman showing them grace. Even in her pain, Dr. Martinez crossed the street, Maya's days began at 5:47 a.m., not by choice, but by necessity. The automatic sprinkler system at Riverside Park activated every morning at that time, and sleeping too close to the flower beds meant waking up soaked. She'd learned this the hard way during her first week there, when she'd chosen a spot behind the memorial garden, thinking the roses would provide cover from view. Instead, she'd been jolted awake by ice-cold water hitting her face, her father's jacket sodden and heavy around her shoulders. Now she slept on the far bench, the one near the basketball court where the sprinklers couldn't reach. It wasn't comfortable, the metal armrest dug into her ribs no matter how she positioned herself, but comfort was a luxury she'd given up along with her apartment, her job, and most of her dignity. The morning routine was methodical, born from military training that refused to die even when everything else had fallen apart. First, she'd fold the thin blanket she'd bought from the thrift store, tucking it into the bottom of her backpack. Then she'd check her belongings, one change of clothes, toiletries that had to last until she could afford more, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and a small journal where she wrote letters to her father that would never be sent. The public restroom near the park's entrance opened at 6 a.m. Maya would be waiting when the maintenance worker, a kind older man named Earl, who never asked questions, unlocked the door. Earl had noticed her there the second week and had started leaving. Industrial soap by the sink, not the harsh stuff meant for mopping floors, but actual hand soap that didn't strip skin raw. He never mentioned it, and Maya never thanked him directly, but she'd leave small things sometimes. A flower from the memorial garden placed by the door, or one of the smooth stones from the playground that she'd polish until it gleamed dot in the restroom mirror. Maya would examine herself with the same critical eye she'd once used for pre-mission inspections. Her black hair had grown longer than she'd worn it since high school, hanging past her shoulders in waves that she kept tied back with an elastic band that was losing its grip. Her face was thinner now than it had been 6 months ago when she'd still had a job and an apartment and the illusion that things would work out eventually. The scar above her left eyebrow, courtesy of shrapnel in Kandahar, had faded to a thin white line, but her eyes held a weariness that made her look older than her 32 years. She'd wash carefully, making the most of the running water and privacy. The water was always cold in the mornings, but Maya had learned to be grateful for small mercies. Cold water was still clean water, and clean water was something she'd once gone days without in the mountains of Afghanistan. By 7 a.m., she'd be walking toward downtown, her pace steady and purposeful despite having nowhere specific to go. The walk served multiple functions. It kept her moving, which made her less likely to be noticed by police. It allowed her to scan for opportunities, help wanted signs, drop change, discarded items that might be useful. And it maintained the fiction, even to herself, that she was going somewhere important. Maya's internal map of the city had been redrawn over the past 3 months to reflect her new reality. She knew which businesses had public restrooms that didn't require a purchase, which libraries had the most comfortable chairs and the least vigilant staff, and which restaurants threw away food that was still perfectly edible. The Starbucks on 5th Street donated their day-old pastries to a local shelter, but Maya had learned to time her arrival at the dumpster for just after closing, not because she enjoyed the shame of scavenging, but because pride was another luxury she couldn't afford. The library on Morrison Street became her office, her sanctuary, and sometimes her bedroom when the weather was too harsh for the park. She'd claim a table in the back corner, spread out newspapers and magazines as if she was conducting research, and spend hours reading everything she could get her hands on. The librarians, especially Mrs. Patterson, who worked the morning shift, had figured out her situation weeks ago, but treated her with a kindness that was careful not to draw attention. "Doing research today, dear?" Mrs. Patterson would ask, sliding an extra newspaper across the desk along with a cup of coffee that was always going to be thrown out anyway. Maya would nod and thank her quietly, then disappear into the stacks. where she could read in peace. She gravitated toward military history, biography, and anything about Afghanistan or Iraq. It wasn't nostalgia that drew her to these books. Nostalgia implied that she missed something. And Maya wasn't sure she missed the military life as much as she missed having a life at all. Instead, she read because these stories reminded her that she wasn't the only one who'd come home broken. The afternoons were the hardest part of her day, when the library grew crowded with after-school programs and her quiet corner became a hub of activity. She'd pack up her makeshift office and wander the streets, usually ending up at the small diner on Elm Street where the owner, a Vietnamese immigrant named Nguyen, who'd served as an interpreter during the war, had offered her occasional work washing dishes under the table. "You remind me of my daughter," he'd told her the first time she'd asked for work, though Maya suspected his daughter had never slept in parks or counted coins to buy dinner. "She's stubborn too, proud. Sometimes pride is all we have left." The work was sporadic, a few hours here and there when the regular dishwasher called in sick or when Nguyen felt particularly generous. Maya would stand at the industrial sink, her hands red and raw from the hot water and harsh detergent, scrubbing plates and listening to the familiar sounds of a working kitchen. The noise reminded her of the mess halls in Afghanistan, the controlled chaos of feeding people who needed sustenance to survive another day. Nguyen paid her in cash and always included a meal. Maya would eat slowly, making the food last, tasting flavors that reminded her of her mother's cooking. Alina Chen had been first-generation American, born to parents who'd fled the chaos of post-war China, and she'd raised Maya on stories of resilience and adaptation. "We bend so we don't break," Elena would say while teaching Maya to fold wontons or perfect the art of making rice that was neither too sticky nor too dry. But Maya had broken anyway. Not in Afghanistan, where she'd expected it to happen, where IEDs and sniper fire and the constant threat of death had somehow felt manageable because they were external enemies she could identify and engage. She'd broken at home, slowly and quietly, under the weight of bureaucracy and indifference and a system that seemed designed to grind down the people it claimed to support. The VA appointments were a special kind of torture, hours spent in waiting. Rooms that smelled like disinfectant and desperation, surrounded by other veterans who wore their damage-like uniforms they couldn't take off. Maya's caseworker, a young woman named Jennifer, who couldn't have been more than 25, would flip through her file with the detached efficiency of someone processing insurance claims. "I see you've been having trouble maintaining employment," Jennifer would say, as if Maya's inability to hold down jobs was a personal failing rather than a symptom of PTSD that made her jump at loud noises and spiral into panic attacks when supervisors raised their voices. "I'm trying," Maya would reply, which was both true and insufficient. "Have you considered our vocational rehabilitation program? It's a 12-week course that helps veterans transition to civilian careers." Maya had completed 3 different vocational rehabilitation programs. She could update her resume, ace an interview, and explain her military experience in terms that civilian employers could understand. What she couldn't do was make it through a 40-hour work week without her hands shaking during meetings or her vision tunneling when someone slammed a door too hard. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd once led missions in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, making split-second decisions that kept her team alive, but couldn't manage to keep a job at a marketing firm that required her to sit in a climate-controlled office and organize spreadsheets. Her last job had been at a nonprofit that helped homeless veterans, a position that had seemed perfect until Maya realized that seeing her potential future reflected in the faces of the men and women she was trying to help made her spiral deeper into depression. She'd lasted 2 months before having a panic attack during a staff meeting, hyperventilating so badly that someone had called an ambulance. "Maybe you're not ready to work with this population," her supervisor had suggested gently, which was a kind way of saying that a counselor who couldn't control her own Trauma had no business helping others process theirs. Maya hadn't argued. She'd cleaned out her desk, turned in her key card, and walked out of the building knowing that her last connection to stable employment had just evaporated. The eviction notice had come 6 weeks later, now as she walked through the city's afternoon. Shadows, Maya practiced conversations she'd never have with people who'd never understand. She'd explain to her father why she couldn't make his military training translate into civilian success, why the skills that had made her valuable as a soldier, hypervigilance, the ability to function without sleep, comfort with violence, made her unemployable in a world that wanted team players and collaborative spirits. She'd tell her mother why all the lessons about bending instead of breaking had failed, why resilience had its limits, and Maya had found hers in a place that looked nothing like a battlefield. But mostly, she'd ask them both why she'd survived Afghanistan only to be defeated by a system that was supposed to help her, why coming home felt more dangerous than deploying ever had. As evening approached, Maya would make her way back to Riverside Park, passing the same landmarks that had become the boundaries of her shrinking world. The coffee shop where she'd been asked to leave for loitering. The apartment building where she'd lived before the eviction, where her former neighbor Mrs. Kim would sometimes wave from the window, pretending not to notice that Maya was walking by her old home like a ghost haunting its former life. The park felt different in the evenings, quieter but also more alive with the sounds of families finishing their day. Children would be called in for dinner, their voices carrying across the playground with a joy that Maya remembered feeling once, before she'd learned that the world could take everything from you without explanation or apology. She'd settle onto her bench as the sun set, pulling out her journal to write letters to her father that grew longer and more desperate with each passing day. The letters started as reports, military briefings about her status and situation, but evolved into pleas for guidance from someone who'd understood what it meant to serve and sacrifice. Day 847 since discharge, she'd write. Still struggling with the transition, sir. I know you always said that Rangers lead the way, but I can't find the path anymore. The mission parameters keep changing, and I don't know what success looks like in this theater. Sometimes she'd write about the small victories, a kind word from Earl, a day without panic attacks, a moment when she'd helped another homeless veteran find resources. Other times, she'd write about the failures, the mounting evidence that she was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. But tonight, as Maya settled onto her bench with her journal, she found herself writing about the 3 teenagers who'd torn her father's jacket. She wrote about the look in Marcus's eyes when he'd realized what he'd done, about Jenna's tears and Tommy's shock. She wrote about the moment when they'd stepped back, not because they feared her, but because they'd suddenly understood that their victim was a person with a story worth respecting. For the first time in months, Maya found herself wondering if there might be something valuable in her brokenness, some way that her experience, however painful, might serve a purpose beyond her own survival. She didn't have answers yet, but as she folded the letter and tucked it into her journal, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. The first injustice came disguised as policy. Maya was standing in line at the social services office on Tuesday morning, her paperwork clutched in hands that still showed the fading marks from dishwashing at Nguyen's diner, when the security guard decided she looked like trouble. She'd been waiting for 47 minutes, she'd been counting, a habit left over from missions where timing meant the difference between success and catastrophe, when Officer Bradley Morrison approached with the swagger of someone who'd found an easy target. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside," he said, his voice carrying across the crowded waiting room. Every head turned to stare at Maya, their expressions ranging from sympathy to relief that they weren't the one being singled out. Maya looked down at herself, trying to see what Officer Morrison saw. Her clothes were clean. She'd washed them in the library's restroom sink the night before. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wasn't talking loudly, wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't doing anything except existing in a space while poor and homeless. "I have an appointment," Maya said quietly, holding up the letter that confirmed her 10:30 a.m. meeting with a caseworker about emergency housing assistance. Officer Morrison's hand moved to rest on his radio, a gesture that Maya recognized as purely performative. He was performing authority for an audience that was eager to watch someone else get removed from the equation. "You're making other clients uncomfortable," he said, loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. "I need you to leave the premises." Maya scanned the faces around her. Mrs. Hernandez, who'd been sitting across from her, looked embarrassed but not uncomfortable. The young mother with twin toddlers seemed more focused on keeping her children quiet than worried about Maya's presence. The elderly man in the veteran's cap had actually nodded at Maya when she'd sat down, recognizing something in her bearing that spoke to shared experience. "Who complained?" Maya asked. Officer Morrison's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern. You need to leave now, or I'll call for backup." This was injustice wearing a uniform, hiding behind the pretense of maintaining order while actually maintaining a system that punished people for being visible in their poverty. Maya stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. Every eye in the waiting room was on her, and she could feel their mixture of pity and relief like a physical weight. "I'm a veteran," she said, not as a plea but as a statement of fact. "That's nice," Officer Morrison replied, his tone making it clear that it wasn't nice at all, that her service meant nothing to him in this moment. "You still need to leave." Maya walked toward the exit, her appointment letter still in her hand. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversation starting up, the uncomfortable shuffling of people who just watched injustice happen and done nothing to stop it. At the door, she turned back to Officer Morrison. "I'll reschedule," she said. "You do that," he replied, already turning his attention to someone else who might need to be managed. Maya stepped outside into the October morning, the autumn air sharp against her face. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching through the glass as the waiting room settled back into its routine, as if nothing had happened. As if she'd never been there at all. The second injustice happened at the library. 3 days later, Maya had claimed her usual spot in the back corner, spreading out job applications she'd printed from the computer terminals. She'd been there for 2 hours, methodically filling out forms and writing cover letters that would likely never be read, when a woman in an expensive suit approached her table. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice pitched to carry disapproval. "I'm here with my daughter for a research project, and we need this table." Maya looked around the library. There were at least 6 other empty tables visible from where she sat, several of them larger and better positioned near the reference section. She looked at the woman's daughter, maybe 14 years old, who seemed mortified by her mother's approach. "There are other tables available," Maya said politely, gesturing toward the empty spaces. "This is the table we want," the woman insisted. Her voice was getting louder, drawing attention from other patrons. "Some of us are actually here to use the library for its intended purpose." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Maya gathered her papers, not because she had to, but because she recognized the look on the teenager's face, the same expression she'd seen on Jenna's face in the park. Embarrassment mixed with powerlessness, watching an adult in their life behave badly and being unable to stop it. "Mom, please," the girl whispered, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "There's a table right over there." But her mother was committed to her performance now. "I pay taxes that support this library," she announced to the room. "I shouldn't have to work around people who are just here to take up space." Mrs. Patterson appeared as if summoned, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "Is there a problem here?" "This person has been hoarding this table all morning," the woman complained. "My daughter has a school project due tomorrow." Mrs. Patterson looked at Maya's carefully organized papers, then at the multiple empty tables around them, then back at the woman in the expensive suit. "I don't see any table hoarding," she said mildly. "Perhaps you and your daughter would be more comfortable at one of our study tables near the reference section. They have better lighting for academic work." The woman's face flushed red. "I want this table." "And Ms. Chen has been using this table," Mrs. Patterson replied. And Maya felt a flicker of surprise that the librarian knew her name. "If you'd like to wait until she's finished, you're welcome to put your name on our table waiting list." There was no table waiting list, Maya realized. Mrs. Patterson was performing her own kind of authority, using bureaucracy as a shield instead of a weapon. The woman grabbed her daughter's hand and stalked away, muttering about priorities and people like that. The girl looked back over her shoulder at Maya with an expression of apology that reminded Maya painfully of her younger self. Mrs. Patterson lingered for a moment, straightening books on a nearby shelf. "Some people," she said quietly, "mistake kindness for weakness and assume that quiet people have no advocates." She met Maya's eyes briefly. "They're usually wrong on both counts." Maya nodded her thanks, but the interaction had poisoned her concentration. She gathered her papers and left the library earlier than usual, walking the streets until her feet ached, and her mind had processed the casual cruelty of someone who decided that Maya's poverty made her less deserving of public space. The third injustice was more subtle but cut deeper. Maya had finally managed to get a job interview at a small accounting firm downtown. She'd arrived 15 minutes early, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the one professional outfit she'd managed to keep through all her downsizing. The receptionist, a young man with kind eyes, had offered her coffee and assured her that Mr. Davidson would be with her shortly. The interview had gone well. Maya's military experience translated surprisingly well to accounting attention to detail, ability to work under pressure, experience managing complex logistics. Mr. Davidson, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, had seemed genuinely interested in her background and asked thoughtful questions about her transition to civilian life. "Your resume is impressive," he'd said, leaning back in his chair. "Ranger School, 2 deployments, commendations for leadership under fire. That takes real character." Maya had felt a flutter of hope, the first she'd experienced in months. This could be its steady work, enough income to rent a room somewhere, a chance to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. "I'd like to offer you the position," Mr. Davidson had continued, and Maya's heart had soared. "The starting salary is $32,000 with health benefits after 6 months. When can you start?" "Immediately," Maya had replied, perhaps too eagerly. "Excellent. I just need to run a standard background check, verify your address, that sort of thing. Where are you currently living?" The question had landed like a physical blow. Maya had stared at Mr. Davidson's expectant face, trying to find words that wouldn't immediately disqualify her. She couldn't lie. Background checks would reveal everything. But telling the truth meant watching this opportunity evaporate in real time. Between permanent addresses right now," she'd said carefully. "I'm staying at a friend's place while I look for something more permanent." Mr. Davidson's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly. "I see. Well, we'll need a permanent address for tax purposes, direct deposit setup, that sort of thing." "Of course. I should have something by the end of the week. Why don't you give me a call when you get settled?" Mr. Davidson had said, his tone now professional rather than warm. "We'll revisit the position then." Maya had thanked him and left the office knowing she'd never hear from him again. The job offer had been real for exactly as long as it took for her homelessness to become visible. After that, her military service, her qualifications, her impressive interview, none of it mattered. She was a liability, a person whose personal circumstances made her unemployable regardless of her professional capabilities. She'd sat in her car, the rusted Honda that she was somehow still managing to keep running despite having nowhere to park it permanently, and screamed, Not the controlled, purposeful shouts of military training, but the raw, animal sound of someone who'd reached their breaking point and found nothing but more pavement beneath them. The fourth injustice came with a badge and a citation. Maya had been sleeping in her car behind a 24-hour laundromat, parked carefully between streetlights to avoid drawing attention. She'd been using this spot for a week without problems. The laundromat owner, if he'd noticed her at all, hadn't said anything. But at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, Officer Janet Mills decided that Maya's presence constituted a public nuisance. Flashlight beamed through her window had jolted Maya from the first real sleep she'd had in days. She'd sat up slowly, hands visible, knowing that sudden movements could escalate a situation quickly when you were dealing with a nervous cop and a vulnerable population. License and registration, Officer Mills had demanded before Maya had even rolled down her window. Maya had complied, handing over documents while her heart hammered against her ribs. Officer Mills had examined them with the flashlight, taking her time. "You can't sleep here," she'd said finally. "I wasn't aware there was an ordinance against sleeping in your car on a public street," Maya had replied carefully. "Vagrancy. Public. Camping. Take your pick." Officer Mills had already been writing the citation. "You need to move along." "Where am I supposed to go?" Officer Mills had looked up from her citation book, and Maya had seen something flicker across her face. Maybe guilt, maybe irritation at being asked to justify a system that offered no good answers. "Not my problem," she'd said, tearing off the citation and handing it through the window. "You've got until I finish my rounds to be gone from this area." The citation was for $150 money Maya didn't have for a crime that consisted of existing in a space while homeless. She'd driven to a different neighborhood, parked behind a different business, and tried to fall back asleep knowing that tomorrow night she'd play the same game with different stakes. But it was the fifth injustice that broke something fundamental. Inside Maya, she'd been standing in line at the food bank on Morrison Street, holding the intake form she'd filled out with the careful handwriting her father had drilled into her as a child. The volunteers were kind, mostly older women from local churches who treated the people in line with dignity and warmth. Maya had been coming here once a week for a month, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the check-in table, always greeted her by name. "How are you today, Mia?" Mrs. Rodriguez had asked, stamping Maya's form. "I'm well, thank you," Maya had replied, which was a lie but the kind of polite fiction that kept the world running smoothly. Maya had been loading canned goods into her backpack when she'd heard the voices behind her. Two women, volunteers she hadn't seen before, were talking in the loud whisper that people use when they want to be overheard. "It's such a shame," the first woman was saying. "Young people like that, they could be working instead of taking charity. In my day, you found a job and you kept it, no matter what. My husband says half these people are just taking advantage," the second woman replied. "They get free food, free housing assistance, and they don't even try to improve their situation." Maya's hands had stilled on a can of soup. She'd turned slightly, enough to see the women clearly. They were both well-dressed, probably in their 60s, wearing volunteer name tags that identified them as members of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. "I mean, look at her," the first woman had continued, nodding toward Maya. "Healthy, young probably. Educated. There's no reason she can't get a job and take care of herself." Maya had wanted to turn around and explain. To tell them about the job interviews where her homelessness disqualified her, about the PTSD that made normal employment nearly impossible, about the system that promised support for veterans and delivered bureaucracy and frustration instead. She'd wanted to tell them about the nights she'd lain awake in Afghanistan, thinking about coming home to a country that would value her service, only to discover that gratitude had an expiration date and hers had apparently passed. Instead, she'd finished packing her groceries and walked away, carrying their judgment along with her canned goods and dented pride. That night, Sitting on her bench in Riverside Park, Maya had written the longest letter yet to her father. "I used to think the hardest part of being a ranger was the physical challenges," she'd written. "The sleep deprivation, the physical demands, the constant threat of enemy contact. But I was wrong. The hardest part is coming home to discover that the people you served see you as a burden rather than a person. The hardest part is realizing that all the skills that made you valuable as a soldier, hypervigilance, the ability to function on no sleep, experience with violence, make you unemployable in a world that wants team players and stable employees. I keep thinking about what you used to say about leading by example. But I don't know how to lead when I can't even find the path myself. I don't know how to set an example when my life is evidence that the system fails the people who serve it." The sixth injustice arrived in the form of bureaucratic indifference wrapped in a helpful smile. Maya had finally managed to get an appointment with a new VIA caseworker, a young man named Derek who wore earnest expressions and spoke in the careful language of someone trained to manage expectations. She'd been transferred to his caseload after Jennifer had been promoted to a supervisory role, which Maya suspected was bureaucratic code for burned out, and moved to a position where she wouldn't have to deal with actual veterans anymore. Derek's office was decorated with motivational posters featuring soaring eagles and inspirational quotes about perseverance. Maya sat in the plastic chair across from his desk, her paperwork spread between them like evidence in a trial where she was both defendant and prosecutor. "I see you've been having some housing challenges," Derek said, scrolling through her file on his computer screen. "Have you considered our transitional housing program?" Maya had been through this conversation so many times she could recite both parts from memory. "I applied 6 months ago. I was told there's a waiting list." "Right, yes, the waiting list." Derek clicked through several screens, frowning. "It looks like you're number 847 on the list for the region. What does that mean in terms of actual time?" Derek's smile never wavered. "It's hard to say. The program is very popular, and funding is always a challenge. But I want you to know that we're committed to helping every veteran who comes through our doors." Maya stared at him across the desk. This young man who'd probably never spent a night wondering where he'd sleep or counted coins to buy dinner. His commitment felt like a performance, words that had been stripped of meaning through repetition. "In the meantime," Derek continued, "I can refer you to some excellent community resources. There's a soup kitchen downtown that serves meals Monday through Friday, and the Salvation Army has shower facilities available on a first-come, first-served basis." "I know about the soup kitchen," Maya said quietly. "I know about the showers. I know about all the community resources. What I need is actual housing assistance or job placement help, or mental health support that doesn't involve a 6-month waiting list." Derek's fingers tapped against his keyboard. "Well, I can certainly put in a priority request for mental health services. As a veteran with combat experience, you should qualify for expedited processing." "How expedited?" 4 to 6 weeks, typically. Maybe less if there's a cancellation. Maya stood up, gathering her paperwork with the controlled movements that had become her signature response to institutional frustration. 4 to 6 weeks. For an appointment to start the process of maybe getting help for problems that are affecting my life right now. "I understand your frustration," Derek said, and Maya wanted to ask him exactly what he understood about anything. "But these things take time. The system isn't perfect, but it's designed to help as many veterans as possible with limited resources." "The system," Maya repeated, "is designed to process people, not help them. And you know what the worst part is, Derek? You probably genuinely think you're doing good work. You go home at night feeling like you've helped people, when what you've actually done is manage them. You've taken people who served their country and turned them into case numbers and statistics." Derek's smile finally faltered. "Ma'am, I'm doing my best within the constraints of, I know, Maya interrupted. That's the problem. Your best isn't good enough, and the system you're working within is broken. But nobody wants to admit it, because that would require actually fixing things instead of just managing them. She left Derek's office with the same appointments and referrals she'd had when she'd arrived, along with a new understanding that the bureaucracy wasn't accidentally failing her. It was working exactly as designed. It was built to contain problems rather than solve them, to process people rather than help them, and to maintain the illusion of support while ensuring that most people would eventually give up and disappear from the system entirely. The seventh. Injustice came disguised as charity. Maya had been approached by a local news crew while standing in line at the food bank. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and an expensive camera crew, had asked if Maya would be willing to share her story for a segment about veteran homelessness. We're trying to raise awareness, the reporter had explained, her voice pitched with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she saw this as a career-making story. People need to understand what our veterans are going through. Maya had agreed, partly because she thought visibility might help and partly because saying no would have required more energy than she had. The interview had been conducted outside the food bank, with Maya sitting on a bench while the reporter asked questions designed to elicit sympathy rather than understanding. What would you want people to know about your situation? The reporter had asked, leaning forward with practiced concern. That I'm not a victim, Maya had replied. I'm a person who served her country and came home to discover that the support systems I was promised either don't exist or don't work. I'm not looking for pity. I'm looking for the help I was told would be available when I needed it. The story that aired 3 days later bore no resemblance to the interview Maya had given. The reporter's voiceover talked about fallen heroes and tragic circumstances while showing footage of Maya eating at the soup kitchen, footage she hadn't consented to and didn't remember being filmed. Her own words had been edited down to sound bites that removed all context and agency. I served my country, her televised voice said, and now I'm homeless. The segment ended with information about donations to local veteran charities and a phone number for viewers who wanted to help our heroes. Maya watched it on the small TV in the library, surrounded by other patrons who kept glancing at her with expressions of recognition and pity. Mrs. Patterson had appeared beside her as the news moved on to weather. That wasn't the story you told them, was it? She'd asked quietly. Maya had shaken her head, not trusting her voice. Media rarely gets the story right, Mrs. Patterson had said. They want heroes or victims, not complex human beings trying to navigate broken systems. The segment had aired on a Friday night. By Monday, Maya had become a local symbol of veteran homelessness, which meant that people who'd never noticed her before suddenly felt compelled to approach her with advice, offers of prayer, and small bills they'd press into her hands with the satisfied smiles of people who'd done their good deed for the day. I saw you on the news, a woman had said, stopping Maya outside the library. Have you tried getting a job? My nephew manages a restaurant, and they're always looking for dishwashers. Maya had explained about the job interviews, the background checks that revealed her lack of permanent address, the way homelessness created a barrier to employment that couldn't be overcome by willingness to work. The woman had listened with the glazed expression of someone whose worldview couldn't accommodate information that complicated her simple solutions. Well, she'd said finally, I'm sure it will work out if you just keep trying. The eighth injustice was the cruelest because it was delivered by someone who should have understood. Maya had been sitting in the waiting room at the a medical center, finally seeing a doctor about the persistent headaches that had been getting worse over the past month. She'd been waiting for 2 hours when another veteran, a man about her father's age wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, had struck up a conversation. You see any action over there? He'd asked, nodding toward the Afghanistan service ribbon on Maya's jacket. 2 deployments, Maya had replied. Kandahar and Helmand provinces. The man had nodded approvingly. Infantry? Rangers. His expression had changed immediately, shifting from camaraderie to skepticism. Rangers, huh? Didn't know they were taking women in the Rangers. Maya had been having this conversation for years, but it never got easier. I was with the cultural support team. We worked directly with Ranger units on missions that required interaction with local women and children. So you weren't actually a Ranger, the man had said, his voice carrying the dismissiveness that Maya had learned to recognize. You just worked with them. I completed Ranger training. I wore the tab. I was assigned to Ranger units and participated in Ranger missions. Maya's voice had remained level, but she'd felt the familiar frustration building. I'm not sure what definition of actually a Ranger you're using that excludes that experience. The man had snorted. Look, sweetheart, I'm sure you did your part, but let's not pretend it was the same as what the real Rangers were doing. You were support personnel. Maya had stared at him, this veteran who should have understood what it meant to have your service. Questioned, who should have recognized the bonds forged by shared danger and common purpose. Instead, he was using his own military experience as a weapon to diminish hers. I was wounded by an IED while providing security for a village elder meeting, Maya had said quietly. The shrapnel is still in my shoulder. 3 members of my team were killed in that attack. Were they real Rangers? The man had had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he hadn't backed down. I'm just saying, things were different in my day. Standards meant something. Maya had stood up and walked to a different section of the waiting room, but the damage was done. If her fellow veterans couldn't acknowledge her service, who would? If the people who should have understood what she'd sacrificed were instead determined to minimize her contributions, what hope did she have of finding acceptance in the civilian world? But it was the 9th injustice that finally pushed Maya past her breaking point. She'd been approached by a local church group that had heard about her situation through the news story. The pastor, a well-meaning man named Reverend Thompson, had offered her temporary housing in exchange for helping with maintenance work around the church. Maya had moved into the small room above the church office, grateful beyond words to have a roof over her head and a door that locked. For 2 weeks she'd painted walls, fixed broken fixtures, and maintained the church grounds with the same attention to detail she'd once brought to military operations. The work was satisfying in a way that reminded her of the construction projects her unit had undertaken in Afghanistan, building schools and medical clinics in villages that had never had permanent structures for education or health care. She'd felt useful again, competent, like she had something valuable to contribute. Then Reverend Thompson's wife had discovered that Maya was struggling with PTSD. Maya had been painting the fellowship hall when a car had backfired in the parking lot. The sound, sharp and sudden, had triggered a panic attack that left her crouched behind a folding table, hyperventilating and shaking. Mrs. Thompson had found her there 20 minutes later, still struggling to distinguish between the present moment and memories of mortar attacks in Kandahar. Oh dear, Mrs. Thompson had said, her voice carefully neutral. Perhaps we should call someone. Maya had managed to explain about PTSD, about trigger sounds and flashbacks, about the ways that combat trauma could intrude on everyday life without warning. Mrs. Thompson had listened with the polite attention of someone receiving unwelcome information. That evening, Reverend Thompson had knocked on Maya's door with an expression that she'd learned to recognize, the look of someone who discovered that helping people was more complicated than they'd expected. Maya, he'd said gently, my wife and I have been talking, and we're concerned that our church might not be the best environment for someone with your challenges. We have children here regularly, and if you were to have another episode. Maya had packed her belongings while Reverend Thompson waited in the hallway, making conversation about how sorry he was and how they'd pray for her, and how they hoped she understood it was nothing personal. She'd thanked him for his kindness, because that's what her parents had taught her to do when people tried to help, even when their help came with conditions that made it ultimately worthless. She'd left the church that night with her backpack and her father's torn jacket. Walking through the October darkness toward Riverside Park and the bench that had become the most permanent address she had dot, as Maya settled back into her old routine, she found herself thinking about the pattern of all these injustices. Each one had been delivered by someone who probably saw themselves as a good person doing their job, following the rules, maintaining order, or even trying to help. None of them had been motivated by cruelty. They'd been motivated by systems that prioritized process over people, rules over compassion, and the appearance of helping over actual help. The security guard at social services had been maintaining order. The woman at the library had been asserting her rights as a taxpayer. Mr. Davidson had been following standard employment practices. Officer Mills had been enforcing city ordinances. The volunteers at the food bank had been expressing concern about resource allocation. Derek had been working within his assigned parameters. The news reporter had been telling a story that would generate ratings and donations. The Vietnam veteran had been protecting what he saw as the integrity of military service. And Reverend Thompson had been prioritizing the comfort and safety of his congregation. Each decision had been individually reasonable and systemically devastating. Each person had been a cog in a machine designed to process problems rather than solve them, to manage people rather than help them, and to maintain existing power structures rather than challenge the conditions that made those structures necessary. Maya wrote about this realization in her letter to her father that night, sitting on her bench as the park settled into its nighttime quiet. "I think I'm beginning to understand something you tried to teach me about leadership," she wrote. "You used to say that the most dangerous enemy was the one who didn't know he was your enemy, because he'd fight you while believing he was doing the right thing. I thought you were talking about insurgents and enemy combatants, but now I think you were talking about systems. About the way that good people can do terrible things when they're working within structures that reward the wrong behaviors. I don't know how to fight an enemy that doesn't know it's an enemy. I don't know how to change a system that's working exactly as it was designed to work. But I'm starting to think that maybe the first step is refusing to disappear quietly. Maybe the first step is making the invisible visible, even when that makes people uncomfortable. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but I think those kids who tore my jacket might have taught me something important. They stepped back when they realized I was a person with a story worth respecting. Maybe that's where change starts with the moment when people stop seeing a problem to be managed and start seeing a person to be heard." As Maya folded the letter and prepared to try to sleep, she felt something shifting inside her. The accumulated weight of all these injustices was still there, but it was beginning to transform from a burden that crushed her into a fuel that might drive her forward. She didn't have a plan yet, but for the first time in months, Maya felt like she might be ready to stop retreating and start fighting back. The transformation began not with Maya's story becoming known, but with other people finally beginning to listen. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been haunted by what she'd witnessed in Riverside Park for 3 days. The image of Maya standing motionless while teenagers destroyed her jacket, then walking away with such dignity despite her obvious pain, had lodged itself in Sarah's mind like a splinter that couldn't be ignored. As the head of the city's Department of Veterans Affairs, Sarah had seen thousands of files, reviewed countless cases, and approved or denied hundreds of benefit claims. But she'd never seen a veteran's story unfold in real time, never witnessed the daily indignities that transformed statistics into human suffering. Sarah had tried to dismiss her concern as misplaced emotion, the kind of inappropriate personal involvement that could cloud professional judgment. But on Thursday morning, she found herself driving to Riverside Park instead of going directly to her office, scanning the benches and walking paths for a woman in a torn leather jacket. She found Maya sitting by the memorial garden, reading a paperback book that looked like it had been rescued from a donation bin. Maya looked up as Sarah approached, her expression wary but not hostile, the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to assess potential threats quickly. "Excuse me," Sarah said, suddenly uncertain how to explain her presence. "I saw what happened to you the other day, with the teenagers. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Maya closed her book, using her finger to mark her place. "I'm fine," she said, which was clearly not true but was probably the safest answer when talking to a stranger who might be a social worker, a reporter, or someone else with the power to make her life more complicated. "I'm Dr. Sarah Martinez," Sarah continued, sitting on the bench without waiting for an invitation. "I work for the city's Veterans Affairs Department. I know that probably doesn't inspire confidence, given how well our systems have been serving you, but I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here because what I saw the other day made me realize how little I understand about what veterans in your situation actually experience." Maya studied Sarah's face, looking for the tells that would indicate whether this was genuine concern or another performance of caring, designed to make the speaker feel better rather than actually help. Sarah seemed to recognize the scrutiny and submitted to it patiently, keeping her hands visible and her posture open. "What is it you want to understand?" Maya asked finally. "Everything," Sarah replied. "How someone with your obvious intelligence and military background ends up sleeping in parks. How our systems fail people so completely that veterans are choosing benches over the services we're supposed to provide. How we've created a bureaucracy that's so focused on processing people that we've forgotten we're supposed to be helping them." Maya felt something loosen in her chest, not hope, exactly, but a recognition that she was being seen as a person rather than a problem. "How much time do you have?" Sarah checked her watch, then turned off her phone. "As much as you need." Maya told her story then, not the abbreviated version designed for intake forms and caseworkers, but the full narrative of a woman who'd served her country with distinction and come home to discover that gratitude had an expiration date. She talked about the job interviews that ended when her homelessness became visible, about the VA appointments where well-meaning people offered resources that didn't exist, or came with waiting lists that stretched beyond her ability to survive. Sarah listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, without explaining how the systems were supposed to work in theory. She asked questions that indicated she was actually processing what Maya was saying rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. "The cultural support team," Sarah said when Maya described her military service. "I've read about that program, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually served in that capacity. What was that like?" Maya described the missions, the way CST members had to be qualified in combat operations, while also serving as cultural liaisons and interpreters. She talked about the unique challenges of being a woman in special operations, the additional scrutiny, and the constant need to prove herself capable of handling the same dangers as her male colleagues. "So when people question whether you were really a ranger," Sarah said, "they're essentially questioning whether you were really in danger, really contributing to the mission." "Exactly," Maya replied. "They want to support the troops, but only the troops that fit their idea of what a soldier looks like. Everyone else is just support personnel who happen to be in the area." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the morning joggers circle the park's walking path. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "For what?" "For running a department that processes people like you through systems designed to manage problems rather than help human beings. For being so focused on metrics and efficiency that I've lost sight of the fact that every case file represents someone's life falling apart in real time." Maya looked at Sarah more carefully, recognizing something she hadn't expected to see: genuine accountability rather than defensive explanations. "What happens now?" Maya asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I'd like to find out. Would you be willing to work with me to understand how we can do better?" Not as a case study or a poster child for veteran homelessness, but as a consultant who can help us see where our systems are failing and what it would take to actually fix them. The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end, Sarah had filled a notebook with observations and questions, and Maya had felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that her expertise might be valued rather than just her need managed. The second revelation came through. Mrs. Patterson at the library. Maya had been back to her routine for several days, spending her mornings at the library and her afternoons walking the city streets. When Mrs. Patterson approached her table with an expression that mixed excitement with careful concern. "Maya," she said quietly, "there's someone here who'd like to meet you, another veteran. She says she's been looking for people who served in Afghanistan." Maya looked up to see a woman about her own age standing near the reference desk wearing jeans and a sweater that looked expensive but not ostentatious. She had the bearing that Maya recognized in other veterans, a way of holding herself that suggested awareness of exits and sight lines, readiness without aggression. "Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Park," the woman said, extending her hand when Maya approached. "Army Medical Corps. I served in Kandahar from 2018 to 2019. Maya shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Maya Chen, 75th Rangers Cultural Support Team. I was in Kandahar and Helmand, 2017 to 2019. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. "CST. Jesus, you were embedded with the Rangers for village operations. I treated some of your team members after the Eid attack near Fob Shank." The recognition hit Maya like a physical blow. She remembered the medical tent, remembered a female doctor with steady hands and a calm voice who'd worked on Maya's shoulder while mortar fell in the distance. She remembered thinking that the doctor looked too young to be handling trauma surgery in a combat zone, but her competence had been undeniable. "You saved my life," Maya said simply. "You and about 300 other people over the course of that deployment," Jessica replied. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I've been tracking what happens to women veterans after they come home, and the statistics are disturbing." Jessica had been working on her doctoral dissertation in public health, focusing specifically on the transition experiences of women who'd served in combat roles. Her research had led her to libraries and homeless shelters, VA offices and community centers, anywhere she might find veterans who'd fallen through the cracks of existing support systems. The official numbers say that female veteran homelessness is relatively rare, Jessica explained as they sat in the library's quiet corner. But the official numbers only count people who are accessing services through official channels. They don't count people like you, who've given up on the VA or who can't navigate the bureaucracy, or who don't fit the demographic assumptions built into the data collection. Jessica had been conducting informal interviews for 6 months, building a database of experiences that didn't show up in government statistics. She'd found women sleeping in cars, couch surfing with friends who were getting tired of providing support, staying in relationships that had become abusive because the alternative was sleeping on the street. "What I've discovered," Jessica continued, "is that there's an entire population of female veterans who are essentially invisible to the systems designed to help them. The services assume male veterans with substance abuse issues, and when women show up with PTSD or employment barriers or housing instability, they either don't qualify for programs or they qualify for programs that don't exist." Maya felt the familiar mix of validation and frustration that came with having her experience confirmed by someone with credentials and authority. "So what do you plan to do with this information?" "I don't know yet," Jessica admitted. "But I think the first step is making the invisible visible. I've been documenting stories, building a database of experiences that contradict the official narrative about how well we're serving women veterans." Jessica pulled out a tablet and showed Maya a map of the city with red dots marking locations where she'd interviewed veterans. The dots clustered around libraries, parks, 24-hour businesses, and other places where homeless people could exist without being immediately moved along by authorities. "This is just one city," Jessica said. "But I suspect this pattern repeats. Everywhere. Women veterans are homeless, but they're homeless differently than men. They're more likely to be couch surfing or sleeping in cars. They're more likely to have children with them, which means they can't access shelters that don't accommodate families. They're more likely to be dealing with military sexual trauma on top of combat trauma, which makes traditional group therapy approaches ineffective or even re-traumatizing." Maya stared at the map, seeing her own experience reflected in the scattered red dots. "You're building a case." "I'm building evidence," Jessica corrected. "But evidence is only useful if someone with power is willing to look at it and act on it." The third revelation came through an unexpected source: Marcus, the teenager who'd torn Maya's jacket. Maya was leaving the library when she saw him waiting by the entrance, shifting his weight from foot to foot with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure they'd made the right decision. When he saw her, he straightened up but didn't approach, waiting for her to acknowledge him. "Marcus," Maya said, surprised to find that she remembered his name. "Ma'am," he replied, the formality awkward in his teenage voice. "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a minute." Maya studied his face, looking for signs of hostility or mockery, but found only the same shame she'd seen when he'd stepped back from her tattoo. "All right." Marcus glanced around nervously, then seemed to steel himself for whatever he'd come to say. "I wanted to apologize again for what we did, for tearing your jacket." "You already apologized," Maya said. "Yeah, but ... Marcus struggled with words that seemed too big for his mouth. "I keep thinking about it, about what you said, about your father's jacket. And I looked up the Rangers online, and I read about Afghanistan, and I..." He trailed off, looking miserable. "You what?" "I told my mom what happened," Marcus said in a rush, "and she freaked out. Not at me, but at the situation. She said if someone like you is sleeping in parks, then the whole system is broken." Maya felt something shift in her chest. "Your mother said that?" Marcus nodded. "She works for the county, in social services. She said she sees a lot of veterans who can't get help, but she never realized how bad it was until I told her about meeting you." He reached into his backpack and pulled out an envelope. "She wanted me to give you this. It's not much, but she said maybe it could help you get your jacket fixed or something." Maya took the envelope, feeling the weight of folded bills inside. "Marcus, I can't accept this." "Please," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "We messed up. We hurt you because we thought you were... because we didn't know." He stopped, trying again. "My mom says sometimes the only way to fix a mistake is to do something that makes the world a little better. This isn't enough to fix what we did, but maybe it's a start." Maya opened the envelope and found $200 in small bills, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for serving our country. I'm sorry our country hasn't served you better. Patricia Williams, Mess W." "Your mother is Patricia Williams?" Maya asked. Marcus nodded. "You know her?" Maya almost laughed. Patricia Williams was the supervisor who'd been promoted away from direct veteran services, the woman who'd been replaced by Derek and his motivational posters. Maya had never met her, but she'd heard other veterans talk about her with the kind of respect reserved for people who actually got things done. "Tell your mother I said thank you," Maya said, folding the envelope and putting it in her pocket. "And Marcus, what you and your friends did was wrong, but coming here to face it was right. That takes courage." Marcus nodded, looking relieved. "My mom wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to her about what it's really like trying to get help through the system. She says the people making decisions need to hear from people who've actually tried to navigate the services." Maya felt another piece clicking into place. "Tell her yes." The fourth revelation came through Dr. Martinez's investigation into Maya's case file. Sarah had returned to her office after their conversation in the park, with a new understanding of how her department looked from the outside. She'd spent years focused on efficiency metrics, processing times, and budget allocations, measuring success by how many people moved through their systems, rather than how many people were actually helped. Maya's file told a story that Sarah recognized as both unique and representative. The paperwork showed a veteran who'd applied for multiple services, attended required meetings, and followed prescribed procedures. What it didn't show was the human cost of a system that treated each need as a separate issue to be addressed by a different department with different requirements and different waiting lists. Sarah had called Maya's previous caseworkers, starting with Derek and working backward through the chain of people who'd processed her requests for help. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: well-meaning people working within constraints that made actual help nearly impossible. She seemed resistant to services, Derek had explained when Sarah asked about Maya's case. She'd get frustrated with the process and stop following up on referrals. What kind of referrals? Sarah had asked. Standard stuff. Transitional housing waiting list, mental health screening, job placement services. But she didn't seem interested in participating in the programs. Sarah had pulled Maya's complete file, including notes from caseworkers she'd never met. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd initially engaged enthusiastically with every program offered, only to discover that most of the programs were either underfunded to the point of ineffectiveness or designed for demographics that didn't include her specific needs. The transitional housing program had a 2-year waiting list and required participants to be actively enrolled in substance abuse treatment, which Maya didn't need. The mental health services were group therapy sessions designed primarily for male veterans with alcohol addiction. The job placement program connected veterans with entry-level positions that required permanent addresses and reliable transportation. Each program addressed a piece of Maya's situation while ignoring the way all the pieces interconnected. She needed housing to get a job, but needed a job to qualify for housing assistance. She needed mental health support to manage PTSD symptoms that interfered with employment, but the available mental health services weren't designed for her specific trauma or gender. She needed immediate support to survive while accessing longer-term services, but the immediate support was designed to tide people over for weeks rather than months. Sarah had seen this pattern in other files, but she'd always assumed it was a resource allocation problem. Too many people needing help and not enough funding to provide it. What Maya's story had shown her was that it was also a design problem. The systems were built around assumptions about who veterans were and what they needed, and those assumptions excluded people like Maya by definition. The fifth revelation came through Mrs. Rodriguez at the food bank. Maya had been volunteering at the food bank for 2 weeks, helping with intake and distribution as a way to give back and stay busy. Mrs. Rodriguez had accepted Maya's offer to help with the quiet understanding of someone who recognized that being useful was sometimes more important than being helped. Working behind the counter gave Maya a different perspective on the community of people accessing services. She saw regulars who came every week, families with children who were clearly going hungry between distributions, elderly people who were choosing between food and medication, and other veterans who were navigating their own complicated relationships with systems designed to help them. "You're good at this," Mrs. Rodriguez had commented, watching Maya help a young mother figure out which services might be available for her children. "You make people feel like human beings instead of charity cases." Maya had been struck by how different the experience felt from this side of the counter. When she'd been a client, the focus had been on processing her efficiently and moving her through the line. As a volunteer, she could take time to actually listen to people, to help them navigate resources, to treat them as individuals with complex needs rather than problems to be solved. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, about starting a support group specifically for women veterans. There are more of you accessing services than people realize, but you don't always fit into the existing programs. Maya looked around the distribution center, noticing for the first time how many of the people in line were women who carried themselves with the bearing she recognized in other veterans. She'd been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't seen the broader community of people with similar experiences. How many? Maya asked. Women veterans? I'd estimate maybe 15% of our regular clients, but they tend to be invisible because they don't always identify themselves as veterans when they're accessing services. Mrs. Rodriguez showed Maya the intake forms, pointing to the demographic information that clients filled out voluntarily. Many people left the veteran status question blank, and Mrs. Rodriguez suspected that women were less likely to identify themselves as veterans because they'd learned that it often led to questions about their service that felt more like interrogations than attempts to provide appropriate support. What would a support group for women veterans look like? Maya asked. I don't know, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. That's why I'd want someone like you to help design it. Someone who understands both the military experience and the experience of trying to navigate civilian systems that weren't built with you in mind. The sixth revelation came through an unexpected phone call. Maya had been sitting in the park, reading a book that Jessica had loaned her about military trauma and civilian transition when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. Is this Maya Chen? The voice was female, professional, with a slight accent that Maya couldn't place. Yes, my name is Amanda Restrepo. I'm a reporter for the Washington Post, and I've been working on a story about women veterans and homelessness. Dr. Jessica Park gave me your name and said you might be willing to talk to me about your experiences. Maya's first instinct was to hang up. The local news story had been a disaster, turning her into a symbol rather than a person, editing her words to fit a narrative that had nothing to do with her actual experience. I'm not interested in being a victim story, Maya said carefully. That's exactly why I want to talk to you, Amanda replied. I've been covering military and veteran issues for 8 years, and I'm tired of stories that either turn veterans into heroes or victims without acknowledging that you're complex human beings dealing with systemic failures. Dr. Park showed me some of her research, and what I'm seeing is a pattern of institutions failing people, not people failing to take advantage of institutions. Maya found herself curious despite her skepticism. What kind of story are you writing? An investigation into how the VA and local support systems handle women veterans, particularly those with combat experience. I'm looking at policy decisions, funding allocations, program design, the structural issues that create the conditions where someone with your qualifications and service record ends up sleeping in parks. Amanda had been researching the story for 6 months, traveling to different cities and interviewing veterans, service providers, and policymakers. What she'd found was a pattern of well-intentioned programs that were designed based on assumptions about who veterans were and what they needed, assumptions that excluded women veterans by default. The programs are designed for male veterans with substance abuse issues, Amanda explained. When women veterans show up with different needs, PTSD without addiction, employment barriers related to gender discrimination, housing instability, related to family responsibilities, they either don't qualify for services or they qualify for services that don't actually address their needs. Maya agreed to meet with Amanda the next day, with the understanding that she could end conversation at any time if it started to feel exploitative. The seventh revelation came through Patricia Williams. Marcus's mother had requested a meeting with Maya through Sarah Martinez, who'd agreed to facilitate the conversation. Patricia Williams turned out to be a woman in her 40s with the efficient warmth that Maya associated with good military officers, someone who cared deeply about the people under her command, but didn't have time for nonsense when there was work to be done. I've been working in veteran services for 12 years, Patricia said, settling into a chair in Sarah's office. And I've been watching the system fail people like you for most of that time. The difference is that now I have a boss who might actually be willing to listen to solutions instead of just managing problems. Patricia had been keeping her own unofficial database of cases that fell through the cracks, veterans who didn't fit the demographic assumptions built into existing programs, who needed services that didn't exist, or who gave up on the system before receiving help. Maya's story was familiar to her in its broad outlines, but unique in its specific details. The problem, Patricia explained, is that policy gets made by people who've never tried to navigate the systems they're designing. They create programs based on theoretical needs rather than actual experiences, and they measure success by how many people get processed rather than how many people get helped. Patricia had been documenting these systemic failures for years, writing reports that got filed away and recommendations that got lost in budget negotiations. But now she had Sarah's attention, and Sarah had the authority to make changes. What would it take to fix this? Sarah asked. Patricia pulled out a thick folder that she'd apparently been carrying around for months, waiting for someone in authority to ask that exact question. First, we need to redesign intake procedures to actually assess what people need, instead of sorting them into existing program categories. Second, we need flexible funding that can address multiple interconnected needs instead of requiring people to access separate programs for housing, employment, and mental health support. Third, we need programs specifically designed for women veterans, particularly those with combat experience. Maya listened to Patricia outline a comprehensive reform plan that addressed every barrier she'd encountered in trying to access services. The plan was detailed, well-researched, and probably expensive to implement. How much would this cost? Sarah asked. Less than we're currently spending on processing people through programs that don't work, Patricia replied. Right now, we're paying for the same people to cycle through multiple services without ever getting the help they need. It would be cheaper to provide effective services the first time than to keep managing the same problems repeatedly. The eighth revelation came through a town hall meeting that Sarah organized. Sarah had decided that the best way to understand the scope of the problem was to bring together veterans, service providers, and policymakers for an open conversation about what was working and what wasn't. She'd rented the community center at Riverside Park and invited everyone Maya had encountered over the past months: Mrs. Rodriguez from the food bank, Mrs. Patterson from the library, Nuvin from the diner, Earl from the park maintenance crew, and dozens of other people who interacted with homeless veterans in their daily work. Maya had been nervous about speaking in front of a crowd, but Sarah had assured her that the format would be conversational rather than formal presentations. When Maya walked into the community center and saw the circle of chairs and the faces of people she recognized, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the sense of being part of a community that cared about her well-being. The conversation that followed was unlike any official meeting Maya had ever attended. Instead of PowerPoint presentations and bureaucratic language, people talked about real experiences with specific names and faces. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about the women veterans who came to the food bank but didn't identify themselves as veterans because they'd learned that it led to more questions than help. Mrs. Patterson talked about the veterans who used the library as a day shelter but couldn't access the computer terminals for job searches because they didn't have permanent addresses to establish library cards. Earl raised his hand tentatively. I see Miss Maya and others like her every morning, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the room. Good people who just need a place to be safe while they figure things out. But the rules say they can't stay, so they keep moving, and moving makes everything else harder. Nguyen spoke about the veterans who came to his restaurant looking for work but couldn't provide the documentation that employers required because their homelessness made it impossible to maintain the paperwork trail that stable employment demanded. As Maya listened to these perspectives, she realized that her individual story was part of a much larger systemic failure. Every person in the room had witnessed pieces of the same pattern: veterans falling through cracks that existed because the systems were designed for different problems than the ones they were actually encountering. "What I'm hearing," Sarah said as the formal discussion began to wind down, "is that we have a lot of good people trying to help within systems that make helping difficult or impossible. The question is whether we can redesign those systems to actually serve the people they're supposed to help." The ninth revelation came through Jessica's research presentation. Jessica had been invited to present her preliminary findings to the town hall group, and her data confirmed what everyone in the room had observed anecdotally. Women veterans were experiencing homelessness at rates that were significantly higher than official statistics suggested, but they were experiencing it differently than men, which made them invisible to systems designed around male experiences. Women veterans are more likely to be couchsurfing or sleeping in cars rather than accessing shelters, Jessica explained, projecting a map that showed the locations where she'd conducted interviews. They're more likely to have children with them, which excludes them from many services. They're more likely to be dealing with military sexual trauma in addition to combat trauma, which makes group therapy approaches inappropriate or re-traumatizing. Jessica's research also revealed that women veterans were more likely to have served in support roles that involved combat exposure without being officially classified as combat veterans, which affected their eligibility for certain services. Maya's experience as a cultural support team member was extreme but not unique. Many women had served in roles that exposed them to the same dangers as their male counterparts while being categorized differently for administrative purposes. The current system assumes that veterans are male, struggling with substance abuse, and need transitional housing while they get clean and find work, Jessica continued. When women veterans show up with PTSD, employment barriers related to gender discrimination, and housing instability related to family responsibilities, they don't fit the template that services are designed around. The data was compelling. But what struck Maya most powerfully was seeing her experience reflected in the experiences of dozens of other women. She wasn't uniquely broken or unusually unable to navigate systems. She was experiencing the predictable result of systems that weren't designed with her in mind. The 10th revelation came through Amanda's investigation. Amanda had been working her story for 3 months when she called Maya with findings that put the local failures in a national context. The Washington Post had resources that allowed Amanda to analyze veteran services across multiple states, and what she'd found was a pattern of systemic discrimination that was largely invisible, because it was embedded in program design rather than explicit policy. "I've been looking at federal funding for veteran services," Amanda explained during a phone conversation that lasted 2 hours. "The money is allocated based on demographic assumptions that haven't been updated since the 1980s. Programs get funded to serve male veterans with substance abuse issues because that's what the data from previous wars suggested veterans would need. But the veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan included unprecedented numbers of women, many of whom had served in combat roles. The injuries they were returning with included traumatic brain injuries and PTSD at rates that earlier conflicts hadn't seen, and the economic conditions they were returning to included a job market that was particularly difficult for people with employment gaps and limited civilian work experience. The system is working exactly as it was designed to work, Amanda said. The problem is that it was designed to solve different problems than the ones veterans are actually facing. Amanda's story would be published in 3 parts, examining federal policy decisions, local implementation failures, and individual case studies that illustrated the human cost of systemic dysfunction. Maya's story would be one of several case studies, but Amanda had promised to present it in Maya's own words rather than editing it to fit a predetermined narrative. The 11th revelation came through Maya's own recognition of her expertise. Maya had spent months thinking of herself as a failure, someone who couldn't navigate systems that other people managed successfully, someone whose problems were evidence of personal inadequacy rather than systemic dysfunction. But listening to Jessica's research, Patricia's reform proposals, and Amanda's investigation, Maya realized that her experience navigating broken systems had given her expertise that was valuable to people trying to fix those systems. She wasn't just a case study or a beneficiary of services. She was someone who understood how policies translated into lived experiences, who could identify the gaps between what systems were designed to do and what they actually accomplished, who could speak with authority about what veterans actually needed rather than what policymakers assumed they needed. Maya had started attending Sarah's weekly staff meetings as an unpaid consultant, reviewing policy proposals and program designs from the perspective of someone who would actually have to navigate the services being created. Her input had already led to changes in intake procedures, modifications to eligibility requirements, and the development of new programs specifically designed for women veterans. "You're not broken," Sarah had told her during one of their regular conversations. "The systems are broken. You're someone who's learned to survive in broken systems, and that survival has given you knowledge that people trying to fix those systems desperately need." As Maya reflected on all these revelations, she realized that the story of her homelessness wasn't just about individual failure or even systemic dysfunction. It was about the gap between the rhetoric of supporting veterans and the reality of how that support was actually delivered. It was about the difference between managing problems and solving them, between processing people and helping them, between maintaining existing power structures and creating conditions where people could thrive. The revelations hadn't solved her problems. Maya was still sleeping in the park, still struggling to find stable employment, still dealing with PTSD symptoms that made normal life difficult. But they had transformed her understanding of those problems from personal failures to systemic challenges that could be addressed through better policies, more effective programs, and a fundamental shift in how society understood its obligations. To people who had served, for the first time since her discharge, Maya felt like she had something valuable to offer beyond her need for help. She had expertise born from experience, insights that could only come from someone who had tried to navigate systems from the bottom up, and a story that illustrated the human cost of policy decisions made by people who would never have to live with their consequences. The recognition was both validating and overwhelming. Maya had spent so long thinking of herself as someone who needed to be fixed that it was difficult to accept that she might be someone whose expertise could help fix broken systems. But as she sat in Riverside Park that evening, writing in her journal by the light of a street lamp, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced since her discharge, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was still homeless, still struggling, still fighting battles that should have been won years ago. But now she was fighting them as someone with all eyes, with expertise that was valued, and with the beginning of a plan that might actually make things better for the next veteran who found themselves sleeping on a bench and wondering how serving their country had led them to this place. The first changes began small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. Sarah Martinez had implemented Maya's suggestions about intake procedures on a trial basis, starting with just 2 caseworkers who were willing to try a different approach. Instead of sorting veterans into existing program categories immediately, they spent the first appointment simply listening, asking open-ended questions about what people needed and what barriers they'd encountered in accessing help. Maya sat in on these appointments as an observer, watching the difference it made when veterans felt heard rather than processed. She saw the subtle shift in body language when people realized they were being treated as experts on their own experiences rather than problems to be solved by someone else's predetermined solutions. "It's working," Patricia Williams reported. After the first month of the pilot program, People are staying engaged with services instead of disappearing after the first appointment. We're actually connecting people with resources that address their specific needs, instead of just the resources we happen to have available. The pilot program revealed what Maya had suspected. Most veterans weren't resistant to services or unwilling to engage with treatment. They were rational people who had learned that the energy required to navigate dysfunctional systems often exceeded the value of the help they eventually received. When the system started working differently, people responded differently. Maya's living situation changed gradually, through a combination of formal and informal support that reflected the new understanding of how help actually worked. Sarah had approved emergency housing assistance that didn't require Maya to enter a program designed for male veterans with substance abuse issues. Mrs. Rodriguez had connected her with a room-sharing arrangement with another woman veteran who was also navigating the transition to civilian life. Patricia Williams had found her part-time work doing intake and advocacy for other veterans, work that paid enough to cover basic expenses, while building on the expertise Maya had developed through her own experiences. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden. Maya still dealt with PTSD symptoms that made some days difficult. She still navigated a job market that was challenging for veterans, especially women veterans with gaps in their employment history. But the difference was that now she was doing it with support rather than alone, with resources that actually addressed her needs rather than generic programs that almost fit, and with a sense of purpose that went beyond her own survival. Maya's first official presentation was to the City Council's Veterans Affairs Committee, where she testified about the experience of trying to access services as a homeless woman veteran. She had prepared extensively, working with Sarah and Patricia, to translate her personal experiences into policy recommendations that the committee could understand and act upon. "Honorable council members," Maya began, her voice steady despite the nerves that made her hands shake slightly. "I'm here not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a veteran with expertise in navigating systems that are supposed to serve people. Like me, I've spent the last year learning how our support systems work from the perspective of someone who actually has to use them, and I'd like to share what I've learned." Maya talked about the way that well-intentioned programs could create barriers instead of removing them, about the difference between managing problems and solving them, about the hidden costs of inefficient systems that processed people repeatedly, instead of helping them effectively the first time. "The current system costs more and helps fewer people than a reformed system would," Maya concluded. "We're not asking for more resources, we're asking for smarter use of existing resources. And we're offering the expertise to help design programs that actually work for the people they're supposed to serve." The committee voted unanimously to fund the pilot program expansion and to implement Maya's recommendations about intake procedures citywide. Council member Rodriguez, who had been skeptical about veterans' issues in the past, stopped Maya after the hearing. "I've heard a lot of testimony about veteran services over the years," she said. "But I've never heard from someone who spoke with such authority about what veterans actually need rather than what we assume they need. Thank you for that perspective." The media attention that followed was different from the local news story that had turned Maya into a symbol. Amanda's investigation in the Washington Post had run as a 3-part series that examined systemic failures in veteran services across multiple states. Using Maya's story as one example of how individual experiences reflected broader policy problems, the series had been picked up by other news outlets and had generated the kind of sustained attention that sometimes translated into policy changes. Maya found herself fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to understand how veteran services could be reformed, from policy researchers who wanted to incorporate her insights into their studies, and from other veterans who recognized their own experiences in her story. "The difference," Maya explained to a reporter from NPR, "is that now people are asking me what needs to be fixed rather than just asking me to describe what's broken. They're treating me as someone with expertise, rather than just someone with problems." Jessica's research had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Military Medicine, and she had been invited to present her findings at conferences on veteran health and military transition. More importantly, her data had been cited in congressional testimony about veteran services funding, and several members of Congress had requested briefings on her findings. What Maya's story illustrates, Jessica explained during her presentation at the American Psychological Association's annual conference, is that individual resilience has limits when systems are fundamentally dysfunctional. We can't solve systemic problems by expecting individuals to be more resilient. We have to fix the systems. Maya had been invited to co-author a paper with Jessica about the experiences of women veterans in transition, and she found that the process of analyzing her own experiences from an academic perspective helped her understand the broader significance of what she'd been through. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I used to think my problems were evidence that I was broken, Maya wrote in the paper's introduction. Now I understand that my problems were evidence that the systems designed to help me were broken. The difference between those two perspectives is the difference between shame and activism, between accepting dysfunction and working to change it. The programs that emerged from these collaborations looked different from traditional veteran services. They were designed around the actual needs that veterans presented, rather than assumptions about what veterans should need. They treated people as experts on their own experiences, rather than passive recipients of services designed by others. They addressed interconnected problems with flexible support, rather than requiring people to access separate programs for housing, employment, mental health, and other needs. Maya's role evolved from beneficiary to program designer to policy advocate. But the most meaningful changes happened in individual conversations with other veterans who found themselves in situations similar to where she'd been a year earlier. "I've been sleeping in my car for 3 months," a young woman named Lisa told Maya during an intake appointment. "I keep applying for transitional housing, but they say I don't qualify because I don't have a substance abuse problem. I don't understand why not having additional problems makes me ineligible for help." Maya recognized the logical trap that Lisa had encountered, the same one that had frustrated her during her own attempts to navigate services. "The programs weren't designed for people like us," Maya explained. "But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It means there's something wrong with the programs." Maya helped Lisa access the new flexible support program that had been developed based on the pilot project's success. Instead of trying to fit Lisa into existing categories, they assessed what she actually needed: temporary housing while she looked for work, support in managing PTSD symptoms that were interfering with job interviews, and assistance in navigating employment discrimination that she was experiencing as a woman veteran. "How is this different from what was available before?" Lisa asked. "Before, you would have had to convince 3 different programs that you qualified for their specific services, and you would have had to access those services separately, even though your problems were all connected," Maya explained. "Now we can address your situation as a whole, rather than breaking it into pieces that don't make sense when they're separated." Lisa was housed within 2 weeks and employed within a month. Her case became another data point supporting the expansion of flexible, holistic services, but for Maya, it represented something more significant: proof that change was possible, that broken systems could be fixed, and that the expertise gained through surviving dysfunction could be channeled into preventing others from having to endure the same struggles. The ripple effects extended beyond formal policy changes. Mrs. Patterson at the library had worked with Sarah's department to develop a program that provided library cards and computer access to homeless veterans. Recognizing that job searches and benefit applications increasingly required internet access that homeless people couldn't afford. Earl and the other park maintenance workers had been trained to recognize signs of veteran homelessness and to Connect people with appropriate resources rather than just moving them along. Nguyen's restaurant had become an informal job training site for veterans who needed work experience that could lead to permanent employment. Nguyen had discovered that veterans often had the discipline and reliability that restaurant work required, but they needed employers who understood that PTSD might make them jumpy around loud noises or that gaps in employment history didn't necessarily indicate unreliability. 6 months after Maya's testimony to the city council, the pilot program had been expanded to serve 300 veterans annually, and similar programs were being implemented in 4 other cities. The Federal Veterans Administration had sent a team to study the city's approach, and Maya had been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about veteran services reform. The most important thing to understand, Maya told the subcommittee, is that veterans aren't asking for charity. We're asking for the support we were promised when we enlisted, and we're offering our expertise to help design systems that actually deliver that support effectively. Representative Johnson, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward in his seat. Ms. Chen, based on your experience both as a veteran who has navigated these systems and as someone who has helped redesign them, what would you say is the single most important change that could be made to improve veteran services? Maya had been asked this question dozens of times, and her answer had evolved as her understanding deepened. Stop designing programs for theoretical veterans and start designing them for actual veterans. Include veterans as partners in program design, rather than just beneficiaries of services designed by other people. And measure success by whether people's lives actually improve, rather than just by how many people get processed through your programs. The changes in Maya's own life were simultaneously dramatic and subtle. She had moved from the room-sharing arrangement to a small apartment that she could afford on her salary from the Veteran Services Department. She had been accepted into a graduate program in public administration, with a focus on program evaluation and policy design. She still dealt with PTSD symptoms, but now she had effective support and treatment rather than being told to wait 6 months for inappropriate services. Most significantly, Maya had found a way to transform her experience of broken systems into expertise that could fix those systems for other people. The skills she'd developed as a ranger leadership, problem solving, the ability to function under pressure, had found new application in civilian work that felt meaningful rather than just necessary for survival. Maya's relationship with her father's memory had also changed. She still wrote letters to him, but now they were reports from someone who had found her mission rather than pleas from someone who had lost her way. "I think I understand what you meant about rangers leading the way," she wrote in one letter. "It's not about being first into danger. It's about finding paths that other people can follow. I was lost for a while, but I was actually learning to navigate terrain that other veterans would have to cross. Now I can help them find better routes than the ones I had to take." The jacket that had been torn by 3 teenagers in Riverside Park had been professionally repaired by a leather worker who specialized in military items. The tears were still visible, but they'd been reinforced with patches that made the jacket stronger rather than just mending it. Maya wore it to her congressional testimony, not as a symbol of victimization, but as evidence that things could be broken and then made better than they were before. Maya's story had become part of a larger narrative about how societies care for people who serve them, but she was careful not to let the symbolic weight overshadow the practical work that still needed to be done. For every Lisa who found help through the new programs, there were other veterans still sleeping in cars, still navigating broken systems, still dealing with the gap between rhetoric about supporting veterans and the reality of how that support was actually delivered. "Change is slow," Maya told a group of social work students during a guest lecture at the local university. "But it's possible. The key is to remember that broken systems aren't natural disasters. They're human creations, and humans can make better ones. It just requires listening to the people who actually have to use the systems. rather than assuming that good intentions are enough to create good outcomes. As Maya stood in front of the classroom, looking at the faces of people who would someday design and implement programs for vulnerable populations, she felt the same sense of purpose that had driven her through ranger training and sustained her through combat deployments. She was leading again, not by being first into danger, but by finding paths that would make the journey easier for the people who would follow. 3 years later, Maya stood at the podium in the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, adjusting the microphone as she looked out at an auditorium filled with graduate students, policy researchers, and practitioners who had come to hear her keynote address for the annual Conference on Veterans Affairs Reform. Her doctoral dissertation, From the Ground Up, Veteran-Centered Approaches to Service Delivery, had been completed 6 months earlier and was already being cited in academic literature and policy documents across the country. The leather jacket hung in her apartment closet now, carefully preserved but no longer needed as daily armor. Maya wore professional clothes to work, business suits that reflected her role as Director of Veteran Services Innovation for the state. But she'd brought the jacket today as a reminder of how far she'd traveled from that bench in Riverside Park. 5 years ago, Maya began, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. I was sleeping in a public park, using my military experience to figure out how to survive on the streets of a city that had no place for me. Today, I'm here to talk about how we transformed those survival skills into policy innovations that have changed how we serve veterans across multiple states. The audience was attentive in a way that Maya had learned to recognize, not just polite, academic attention, but the engaged focus of people who dealt with the practical consequences of the policies being discussed. She could see veterans in the audience, caseworkers, program administrators, and researchers whose work intersected with hers in various ways. Maya clicked to her first slide, a map showing the spread of veteran-centered service programs across the United States. Red dots marked cities where traditional, siloed programs were still the norm. Green dots showed places where integrated, flexible approaches had been implemented. The map told a story of gradual but significant change, with clusters of green dots spreading outward from pilot sites where veterans like Maya had been included as partners in program design. The traditional model of veteran services assumes that we know what veterans need and designs programs to deliver those predetermined services, Maya continued. The veteran-centered model starts with the assumption that veterans are the experts on their own experiences and designs programs to respond flexibly to the needs that veterans actually present. She clicked to a chart showing outcomes data from the two approaches. The differences were striking. Veteran-centered programs had higher engagement rates, better housing stability outcomes, improved employment placement rates, and significantly lower per-person costs over time. When we stop trying to force people into programs that almost fit and start designing programs that actually meet people where they are, everyone benefits, Maya explained. Veterans get more effective help, service providers have more successful outcomes, and taxpayers get better value for their investment in veteran services. Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had flown in from the West Coast where she now ran veteran services for the entire state of California, smiled from the front row. Sarah had been promoted twice since the pilot program in their small city, each promotion taking her to larger jurisdictions where she could implement the approaches that Maya had helped develop. Jessica Park, now Dr. Jessica Park with a faculty position at Johns Hopkins, was taking notes for the book she was writing about women veterans and systemic change. Jessica's research had expanded beyond documentation of problems to evaluation of solutions, and Maya's programs provided some of the most compelling evidence that alternative approaches to veteran services actually worked. The key insight, Maya continued, is that resilience isn't just an individual characteristic, it's also a systems characteristic. Resilient systems are ones that can adapt to serve the people who actually need help, rather than systems that require people to adapt to fit predetermined categories. Maya told the story of the latest program innovation, a mobile outreach unit that brought services directly to places where veterans were living under bridges, in cars, in abandoned buildings, in places where traditional office-based services couldn't reach. The unit was staffed by formerly homeless veterans who could establish trust and credibility with people who'd learned to be suspicious of offers of help. Last month, our mobile unit connected with a veteran who'd been living in his car for 8 months, Maya said. He'd tried to access services through traditional channels, but he had a service dog that most programs couldn't accommodate, and he'd given up trying to navigate systems that seemed designed to exclude him. Within 3 weeks of our outreach contact, he was housed, employed, and connected with mental health support that addressed his specific needs. The mobile unit had been Maya's idea, born from her own experience of how difficult it was to access help when you didn't have stable housing, reliable transportation, or the emotional energy to navigate bureaucratic processes. The program was being replicated in 15 cities, and federal funding had been allocated to expand it nationally. Maya talked about the policy changes that had emerged from grassroots innovations. The Veterans Administration had revised its program design guidelines to require input from veterans who would actually use the services being created. Federal funding formulas had been adjusted to incentivize flexible, integrated approaches rather than just rewarding programs that processed large numbers of people through narrow categories of services. We're seeing the beginning of a fundamental shift in how government agencies think about service delivery, Maya explained. Instead of asking, how can we process more people through our existing programs? Agencies are starting to ask, how can we design programs that actually solve the problems people are experiencing? But Maya was careful not to present the changes as complete or universal. Progress was uneven, and there were still places where veterans encountered the same barriers that Maya had faced 5 years earlier. The difference was that now there were proven alternatives, documented evidence that better approaches were possible, and a growing network of advocates who could push for broader implementation. Change is slow, and it's not automatic, Maya acknowledged. Every improvement has to be fought for, documented, defended, and expanded deliberately. But it's possible, and it's happening. During the question and answer period, a young woman in the back row raised her hand. Dr. Chen, what advice would you give to someone who's currently experiencing the kind of systemic barriers you've described? How does someone survive broken systems while working to change them? Maya paused, recognizing something in the woman's voice that suggested this wasn't just an academic question. Find allies wherever you can, even in unexpected places. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, Earl, the maintenance worker, Mrs. Rodriguez at the food bank. They were as important to my survival and recovery as any formal program. Document your experiences, because your expertise in navigating broken systems is valuable to people trying to fix them. And remember that surviving dysfunction isn't a personal failure. It's evidence that you're stronger than the systems that are supposed to support you. The woman nodded, and Maya made a mental note to connect with her after the presentation. 5 years later, Maya's office in the federal building overlooked the Potomac River, a view that she still found surreal after years of sleeping outdoors and wondering where her next meal would come from. As the newly appointed Assistant Secretary for Veteran Services Integration, Maya was responsible for coordinating services across multiple federal agencies, ensuring that the Department of Veterans Affairs, Housing and Urban Development, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education worked together rather than creating the kind of bureaucratic maze that she'd once navigated. As a homeless veteran, the confirmation hearing had been contentious, with some senators questioning whether someone who'd experienced homelessness could be objective about policy decisions that affected millions of veterans. Maya's response had been measured but firm. Senator, my experience of system failure gives me insights that are essential for preventing those failures from affecting other veterans. she'd said. "I'm not here because I need help. I'm here because I know how help actually works when it's designed and delivered effectively." The programs that had started as local innovations were now national policy. The Veterans Services Integration Act, which Maya had helped draft, required federal agencies to coordinate their veteran services and to include veteran input in program design. The legislation had passed with bipartisan support, largely because it was based on documented evidence of what worked rather than ideological arguments about what should work. Maya's days were filled with meetings that would have seemed impossible. During her months in Riverside Park, she testified before congressional committees, briefed cabinet secretaries, and participated in international conferences on veteran services. But the work that felt most meaningful happened in the margins, the informal conversations with veterans who were experiencing barriers, the mentoring relationships with formerly homeless veterans who were now pursuing graduate degrees or starting their own advocacy organizations. Maya kept the photograph from her parents' wedding on her desk, along with a small smooth stone from Riverside Park that she'd carried through all her moves and transitions. Visitors often asked about the stone, and Maya would explain that it reminded her where she'd learned her most important lessons about resilience, community, and the difference between surviving and thriving. "I picked it up during one of the worst periods of my life," she would say, "but it was also when I was learning things that I couldn't have learned any other way. It reminds me that sometimes you have to go through broken systems to understand how to build better ones." Maya's marriage to Elena Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, who worked as a trauma counselor specializing in veteran mental health, had been featured in a Washington Post profile about couples who'd met through service work. Elena understood the challenges of loving someone with combat trauma, and Maya understood the importance of building relationships that could withstand the pressures of work that dealt with systemic injustice on a daily basis. Their apartment was filled with art created by veterans' paintings, sculptures, photographs that reflected the complexity of military experience and civilian transition. Maya had started collecting pieces not as charity towards struggling artists, but because she recognized the importance of cultural narratives that went beyond simple stories of heroism or victimization. Veterans are artists, engineers, teachers, parents, activists, Maya had said during a speech at the Kennedy Center's Veteran Arts Festival. "We're not just our military service, and we're not defined by our struggles with civilian transition. We're whole people with multiple identities, and the systems that serve us need to recognize that complexity." 10 years later, the Maya Chen Center for Veteran Services Innovation had been built on the site of the former Riverside Park Community Center, incorporating the memorial garden and playground into a campus that served as both a direct service provider and a training center for practitioners from around the world. Maya had insisted that the center maintain the park's accessibility to the broader community. It wasn't a separate facility for veterans, but an integrated part of the neighborhood where veterans and civilians interacted as neighbors rather than as service providers and clients. Maya walked through the memorial garden on her way to the center's